So as I mentioned, we have repeated in the Parshiyot discussing the Mishkan, discussing the construction and the vessels of the tabernacle, the juxtaposition of the prohibition of Shabbat, telling us that as important as the tabernacle is, its construction does not trump, so to speak, the prohibitions of Shabbat. When Shabbat comes, all else is set aside. Shabbat is the highest level that there is. Indeed, as it's described in this week's Parsha, Shabbat Shabbaton, a holy Shabbos, a double Shabbos. And so, in a sense, as I mentioned in the previous installment, that we have 6 days of building a tabernacle, which is really the essence of our life, the other 6 days of the week. And it is this reason which the prohibitions of the seventh day are formulated as being those things which should be used to build a tabernacle, teaching us that the essence of our work week is to make a tabernacle the other 6 days of the week. And the essence of the tabernacle, which is this, for those who don't know, the fancy English word for the Mishkan, the Svetostanok in Slovak, is the idea of elevating the material aspects, the lowest material aspects of creation, and transforming them into something godly, and indeed doing nothing more than revealing their true, already existing godly essence by taking them and using them for something spiritual. But this godly essence is concealed, and what reveals it is the act of the Jew using it in performing a divine commandment. And so if building a tabernacle is what we do on the 6 days of the week, and building a tabernacle means transforming the material universe into something spiritual, and it's not what we do on Shabbat, so it would seem then that on Shabbat we do not engage in this act of transformation. Indeed, that is the case. Shabbat is an entirely different dynamic. It is not a dynamic of transformation. It's a dynamic of devoting ourselves to spirituality. It is not per se a day that we continue this process of transforming material to spiritual. And indeed, in this special dynamic, one would not really be able to transform the material during the week. In order to do that, to transform materiality into spirituality, one has to keep uppermost in his mind the dominance and superiority of spirituality over materiality. In order to do that, he needs to have 1 day of the week which is completely devoted to the spiritual. And so it's a little bit like inhaling, exhaling. The Shabbat is the inhalation of the spirituality. One of the classic work activities which is prohibited on Shabbat is called borer. It means to select. And the idea of selecting means selecting out something from some other things that are different. For example, if there's believe it or not, if there's a fly in the chelent or in one of the dishes, you can't simply remove the fly. This is borer. This is removing something undesirable from something which is desirable. In order to avoid this, you don't have to eat the fly or the food. You take out together some of the good and some of the bad. Symbolically, Hasidus explains that borer is really also a prototypical work activity in the sense all week we are trying to seek out the good, emphasize it, build on it, in this way transform things. On Shabbat, we don't deal with borer. In Shabbat, everything we deal only with good and with positive. And borer, the selecting and the separating good from bad, is an activity which was reserved the other days of the week. So, in a sense, what we have the seventh day is a non-tabernacle day, a non-Mishkan day. And yet, as is explained in many other writings, we are not actually abandoning the house of God. We are not abandoning the tabernacle. We are not abandoning the sanctuary. We are trading a spatial sanctuary for a temporal sanctuary, meaning that the 6 days of the week, particularly when the temple stood, and symbolically now, we deal with the sanctuary in space, and Shabbat then becomes the sanctuary in time. So that is what happens. Now in Vayakhel, again, the Shabbat is mentioned in connection and in the context of the commandments of the construction of the Mishkan. And not only that, but remarkably, a whole special introduction of, and God said to Moses, the classic presentation of something new, is used for both the commandment of the Mishkan and especially and uniquely also for the commandment of Shabbat. Even though, as said previously, this particular command is not for all the commandments of Shabbat, but one particular activity is singled out, is the activity of lighting a fire on Shabbat. Now we say that when we keep the Shabbat is to commemorate that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And hence in many commentaries, and Nachmanides is one of them, handily ruling out the banal idea that Shabbat is just a time to rest, to gain strength for the work week. This is not the case. If this would be the case, the main thing is the work week, and the Shabbat is just a helper to that. In actual fact, it is the 6 days of the week which be assisting us in approaching the holy day, the seventh day, to make that the center of our lives, and truly not the other way around. And so we say that God desisted in creative acts, and therefore the human being, the Jew who keeps the Shabbat, also we desist in acts which are creative by nature. And hence, if we look at all of the work activities that are prohibited, and indeed the general definition, which is that those were the activities in the building of the Mishkan, which is something which is creative, we find generally a pattern that it is activities that involve creating something that are prohibited. And now, for this reason, we can ask a very simple question. How did fire become such an important and prominent malacha? How does that fit into all of that? You know, the Karaites, those who did not acknowledge the written tradition, the oral tradition, were so adamant about this special, explicitly mentioned prohibition, because the ones that were from the Mishkan, from the tabernacle, they had doubts about because it came from the oral tradition. But look, there's a special verse prohibiting fire. So they didn't even allow there to be a fire on Shabbat, never mind light one. And hence they didn't have heating on Shabbat, and they didn't have warm food on Shabbat because they felt you couldn't even light a fire Friday and keep it kindling during the Shabbat day. And by the way, I hasten to emphasize that this also refutes the common misconception that movements which reject the rabbinic tradition were somehow more liberal. Here we see quite the opposite. They rejected the rabbinic tradition, which allows us to have warm food on Shabbat, allows us to keep a fire kindling on Shabbat. But the Karaite tradition, which rejected rabbinic interpretation, were actually more strict and ruled out this possibility. So the real question is fire does not create anything. Fire is a destructive act, seemingly, and we need to understand how fire became such a prototypical Shabbat prohibition, and from this we'll also learn, by understanding what is the productive aspect of fire, applying then this to our mission of the 6 days of the week, and understanding more about how we serve God all week long.